right, we are here today for a conversation with Bob Ashley, who's editor of the Herald Sun newspaper, to commemorate the paper's 125th anniversary. And who better to talk with Bob Ashley than Steve Schewel? Steve founded the Durham-based independent newspaper in 1983 and served as its publisher until 1999. The paper has won some of the most prestigious awards in American journalism, among them the George Polk Award for Environmental Reporting, the Investigative Reporters and Editors National Award, the H.L. Mencken Writing Award, and the Thurgood Marshall Award. A former English teacher and community organizer, Steve has served on the Durham Public Schools Board of Education and been active in the community in many, many other ways. And he is currently a member of the Durham City Council. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much, Lynn. It's wonderful to be here as part of this program. As you all know, our Durham Public Library has become a kind of cultural palace for Durham through the work of Joanne and Lynn and Alice and others. And these programs and all the many, many ways in which they extended the work of the library is just fantastic. Bob interviewed me and a few other independent former staffers not long ago on our 30th anniversary, and so I have been asked to repay the favor. It was a very friendly interview, and so I guess I can be really, really nice. 125 years is amazing for any institution. And we have a lot to talk about today. Let me just first of all just tell you a little bit about Bob. He has been a journalist for a long time. His journalism career started when he worked part-time for the weekly Mount Airy Times in his hometown. And was this while you were in high school, Bob?
While I was in high school,
While
yes.
he was in high school. And then while at Duke, he's older than I am, I just want to let you know that, but not by much. He graduated from Duke in 1970. He was managing editor of the Duke Chronicle. He then went to the Raleigh Times, and he became the city editor there, and then he moved to the Charlotte Observer, where his jobs included assistant metro editor, deputy features editor, deputy metro editor, features editor, and assistant managing editor. And then he left the Charlotte Observer for the Center Daily Times in State College, Pennsylvania, where he became editor, and then moved for 11 years to become the editor of the Messenger Enquirer in Owensboro, Kentucky. So Bob had a tremendous amount of journalism experience before he came here to Durham in 2005 when Paxson bought the Herald Sun from the Rollins family. Bob became the editor, served as editor for 6 years, retired, I'll put that in quotes, and became the director of Preservation Durham for a year, and I guess had the ink in his veins, couldn't resist, went back to the Herald, became editor again, and where he remains today. That's about 45 years as I counted, Bob. That's a lot of journalism.
It's a lot of years. I don't know about it.
And so we are really lucky to have Bob and his incredible wealth of experience to talk not only about the Herald Sun today, but also about journalism, its past and its future. So I just want to, before I ask my first question, set the scene. I stole this from Bob. This is what he did in our panel, and I liked it. 1889, just to think back to Durham in those times, and I've stolen this all freely from Gina Anderson's wonderful history, if you haven't seen it or read it, of Durham County. It's creatively titled Durham County. It is a wonderful, wonderful history of our city. So you can think about those times. Julian Shakespeare Carr had just donated the Oval Horse Racetrack and 67 acres to relocate a little college called Trinity from Randolph County up here to what is now East Campus. If you wondered what that oval was for, it used to be a racetrack. Washington Duke had helped outbid Raleigh to get this college. Raleigh folks had put up about $35,000. He matched their $35,000, and he contributed $50,000 more to start an endowment for Trinity College. And interestingly, both Julian Shakespeare Carr and Washington Duke had felt wounded civic pride and really wanted this college because The Baptists had chosen not to locate a female seminary here because of Durham's, quote, unsuitable factory and mill town atmosphere. We were a gritty town even then. Durham had just become its own county, seceding from Orange County. After a little battle, Durham had established its first graded school. Those who opposed the school, there were a couple of reasons. Some didn't want to get their taxes to go up. But interestingly, some were Republicans, and this included Washington Duke. This was post-Civil War Republicans who were concerned that the school would be funded in a racially discriminatory manner, that there would be African Americans had to fund their own school, and they did a little work and found that only $9.20 would be collected from black taxpayers because of their low wealth, not enough to fund a school. And finally, the opponents of the discriminatory taxation system prevailed, and the school was approved by a referendum and built. James B. Duke was gambling on the installation of the Bonsack automated cigarette rolling machine at this time. Julian Carr had incorporated Golden Belt Manufacturing Company to make bags for the tobacco. Durham had just voted to go dry in those years, so there was a little settlement called Hickstown, now called Crest Street, where they did a booming liquor business. It was a time of tremendous industrial growth, tobacco, cotton mills, railroad came through, and banks were established. And then there were the newspapers. And I'm going to read just a paragraph from Gene Anderson's book about the newspapers. Attempts to keep the populace informed and to give them a sense of cohesion and local pride were undertaken by the semi-commercial, semi-cultural newspaper business. Nothing's changed, Bob.
Nothing's changed.
Which had its own burgeoning in the 1880s. Beside Caleb B. Green's Tobacco Plant, I like the name, a conservative, tactful paper with a democratic political cast, there were several other substantial journalistic endeavors and a handful of short-lived ventures. John D. Cameron's Recorder continued until 1911. There was also James Dyke's Daily Dispatch, a more literary venture that did not survive. The Daily Reporter, David W. Whitaker's creation, the Methodist Advance, the Church Messenger, an Episcopalian paper, the Durham County Republican, the Daily Progress, which is a third-party paper, the Durham Workman, Labor's Organ, was also published in a paper called The Globe, and so forth, and then the Sun, which began in 1889 under James A. Robinson, a veteran newspaperman, and which has survived many an editor, and that includes you, Bob, and financial crisis to the present. And so Durham had a very lively, as Bob told me when Bob and I got together to talk about this not long ago, and as he told me, Durham had a very lively and robust newspaper scene when the Sun was founded 125 years ago. And so, with that little intro, to get some sort of sense of the times, let me just ask Bob a question about something he told me the other day, which I thought was really interesting. He said, the Herald Sun has a founding myth, and he told me that myth, and I thought it was pretty interesting, and so I'm going to start off with that, Bob.
Right. I'm not sure it's a myth. It's in the newspaper archives, and they may be similar to myth, but let me take a shot at it. And that's a great sketch, by the way, Steve, of the times that came in. Between 1880 and 1890, most of those papers that you mentioned came into being. And by 1924, when Gene's predecessor historian, William K. Boyd, who was a Duke professor, was writing about it, noted that by the 1920s, only one of those papers still survived. The Morning Herald was around, but it came along in 1890, 91, right after that period. But it's a wonderful story, because if you think today that media can sometimes be engaged in ways that might surprise us in the modern era in sort of taking sides and being engaged. When the Durham Sun was founded, there was a very, very specific reason for it. Julian Shakespeare Carr, who Steve mentioned, had run a tobacco plant. He bought the only other newspaper at that time, the Durham Recorder. But Washington Duke was irritated because the railroad had built a line to Julian Shakespeare Carr's plant, but not to his tobacco plant. And he wanted a railroad. So he persuaded James Algernon Robinson, who Steve mentioned, to come to leave the Recorder and launch the Durham Sun. Now, if you think things can move swiftly sometimes, 4 weeks later, after the paper was founded, the city authorized the Durham and Northern to extend its tracks up Peabody Street to the Duke factory. By the way, that's the line that now is the Duke Belt line that we're fighting to keep as public space after the railroad has abandoned it, but doesn't seem to want to sell it at anything approximating a reasonable price. And he said editorially interjecting. So let me read you my old colleague, my former colleague Bill Stagg, in the Sun Centennial Edition, told the story of that founding. And let me just read a little bit of it for you. Then came a series of twists and turns that rival anything Hollywood movie makers could cook up. Led by the Sun, people knew that Durham and Clarksville line would put up a fight over what it considered right-of-way infringement by the Durham and Northern. A group gathered on the night of April 9, 1889. Under the direction of Durham and Northern engineers, they laid the track themselves. By morning, when the rails were as far as Corcoran Street, the entire group was arrested on warrants taken out by attorneys for the Durham and Clarksville line. Undaunted, the people went back the next night and laid the tracks all the way to the tobacco factory. Then came the counterattack. Durham and Clarksville workers tore up about 100 feet of the Durham and Northern line before the police stopped them. The dispute eventually wound up in the courts. It was eventually won by the Durham and Clarksville. But that was the reason for the founding of the Sun, and the Sun was, and Robinson, it was deeply involved in that fight. I could go on. It's worth noting that in 1910, Julian Carr bought the Sun. So that was one way, I suppose, of ultimately getting his revenge for that little touch and go. But that was the founding, and you know, we've been involved in Durham affairs for 125 years since.
So you got your editorializing in there about the Beltline, I noticed, which leads me to today's editorial.
Yes.
I have read the Herald cover to cover for the last, I don't know, 40 years or something, every day. And today you had two pieces in that you'd written, so you were busy. And your editorial today was very supportive of our new county manager who's been chosen. But also I would say, can I say that you had a little gentle zinger in there about the county commissioners, and perhaps that you're recommending that maybe they should have searched a little more widely. And so how did you make your decision to write that? And you know, just talk about the process that you go through when you're thinking about that.
Sure, it's a good question, Steve, absolutely. And I don't know that the process has changed a lot in the years. Back in the turn of the century, the entire staff of the Herald, by the way, consisted of about 12 people. Their picture is hanging in our lobby, and that included carriers. So I have a feeling that there was less consultation about editorials in the early days than there is now. But we actually talked about it over a period of 2 or 3 days. The decision obviously was made on Monday. We had kicked it around, interrupted by a snowstorm that disrupted us a little bit. And 2 members of the editorial board sit just a few feet from me, my colleague Nancy Weichel, who was here, and Wes Platt. And we had a couple of conversations about it and concluded that while we had, as the editorial said, every bit of confidence in Randall Davis as the new manager, we felt that the community might have been better served and had a better foundation of confidence had we looked a little bit more broadly at the period we did to make sure that we had the best candidate for it. A position we've urged, by the way, and this was part of our discussion, which we recently have urged upon the school board, as it approaches replacing Eric Vico as superintendent. So it really is of a piece of our thinking that widespread searches turn out the best possible candidate for the job. And while we didn't get into the editorial, it's true that both Tom Bonfield's search before you were on the council was a national one, as was, I think, the Chambers case for search for Casey Steinbacher. So yeah, sure. There's some precedent for that. Let me see if I can get my microphone closer. Got it. Okay, great. Thanks.
And so 125 years ago, there was a very specific axe to grind. The paper was formed for the commercial purposes of, if not a single individual, a single business. when you think now, 125 years later, how do you think of your community responsibilities in that way? Obviously, it's not for a single commercial purpose, but you know, just taking off from that editorial, how do you view your civic role?
Mm-hmm. Sure. You know, I'm not sure that it's changed a lot, Steve, in 125 years. It's probably ebbed and flowed. This newspaper has always been deeply engaged in civic affairs. You know, 3 or 4 years ago, we adopted "We Are Durham" as a sort of our branding phrase. I was looking through some archives recently and discovered programs for 1927 and 28 for the cooking school that we sponsored and ran. So we've been embedded in a lot of different ways. The golf tournament dates back to the 40s. Interrupted slightly by World War II, but the Durham Sun golf tournament has been a fixture for many, many years until the economy made it somewhat more difficult. We ran the front page awards, for example, to honor people. So we see ourselves as being important citizens of the community, as well as an important voice for the community, and as an important source of information for the community. And I don't think that's changed much. Back around the time the Sun was closing in 1990, and the Herald Sun became the combined paper, the editors of both papers talked about how they both strived, set out to cover local news and to outdo each other in that coverage. And I think that, again, embodies a tradition that's existed for most of our 125 years of caring about the community and trying to shine a light on the community and trying to portray the community to itself day in and day out.
Lynn, sure.
Bob,
Yeah.
if you'll move that
Yeah.
line to your other lapel, the reason people
Gotcha.
can't hear is because you're talking.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I was wondering in the meantime, is Nancy Weichel the person that has to tell you whether or not it's strove or strived?
Yes, and she does it very effectively.
Thank you, Nancy.
I told Nancy just the other day that she is a good reminder of one of the gaps in your education if you don't take journalism in college. I never had to take the style book test, and to this day it haunts me, but Nancy regularly saves me from it.
Great. And so it used to be, well, let me just say that with the Independent, we never had to worry about making any choices about covering things broadly. That is to say, we could pick and choose.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still feel like there's a newspaper of record function that the Herald plays, or are those days gone? You know, how do you think about now, and is it different from 125 years ago, or just the 45 years you've been in journalism? Does the Herald play a different role now, or does it still see itself as the newspaper of record?
It's an interesting question, and you mentioned the 45 years. It occurred to me the other day when I was thinking about this that I've actually been alive for over half the existence of the Durham Sun, which is kind of sobering in and of itself. I think, you know, at different times in its history, the paper has probably seen itself more as a paper of record, and other times less so. The paper in 1889, when it started, was 4 pages. Durham was much smaller then, but I suspect that it was a little bit more difficult to contain everything in those 4 pages. There were some fascinating tidbits back then in the paper. There was some flowery coverage early on of funerals and things like that. But I don't think any newspaper in a metropolitan area this size these days can be truly a paper of record in the sense that it might once have been. We don't list, as the Messenger and Inquirer where I was in Owensboro did, we don't list every traffic accident in which no one was injured. That's certainly a level we, I suppose, could try to do, but there's not enough newsprint for us to do that. So we think that we are responsible for keeping a record of the major ebb and flow of events, but I don't think we do it with the kind of absolute sort of mining down into the very deep public record that we might have done. I think more of that will come actually in the years ahead as the online existence of news sort of frees us from the bounds of what newsprint can accommodate on a given day.
And in these years that you've been in the business, what are the critical changes you think about? I mean, there have been so many, but when you think about some of the most important ones, what are they in the last 45 years? What's really changed and has really made a difference?
Well, most profoundly what's changed has been the competitive environment and the context in which we operate. Certainly back in the day, in 1889, if you wanted news about what was happening in your town, in Durham or any other town, you turned to whatever newspaper or newspapers were out there, or you talked over the back fence with your neighbor. The radio changed that profoundly. When people could find out on the radio who won the presidential contest, they were less likely to gather around the newspaper office to see the wire service bulletins posted on a board, which used to happen back in the teens and 20s. Television changed it. Needless to say, the internet has changed it even more. Through all of that, though, I think there has been a constancy, which is the effort to record life. So while many things have changed in terms of technology, if you want to talk about technological change, I could take a picture, several pictures of you right now with this. Back in 1946, when the paper hired its first photographer, and he went around with this, a speed graphic. You could take one picture at a time. So that's certainly changed. And if you look at the papers in the 30s, 20s, there were very few photographs. Newspaper photography, well, photography had been around since the Civil War. We have great images of the Civil War. The reproduction capability was not there. So we faced technological changes. We certainly faced delivery changes, expectation changes, and competitive changes. Again, some things I might argue have remained the same. During the snowstorm last week, many of you, I suspect, I would ask the question, but I won't for sure, are subscribers. Did any of you were subscribers not get your paper on Thursday morning? Many of our subscribers didn't. Many were understanding. Others not so much, even in times of peril. And I know one person particularly was angry with me. But that's been around for a long time. That hasn't changed. This is a picture of a young kid on a bike. And as an adult, this guy named Mark Featherston, who wrote a series of scrapbook images for the paper back in the 80s. And in this one, I just want to read a bit about it. That house, by the way, is Washington Duke's house in the background. He said, "This place scared the daylights out of me. Mr. Washington Duke lived there, and I thought it was haunted. All the heralds were delivered on the porch. Mr. Duke wanted his stuck inside his screen door. I used to sneak up the driveway, walking my bike. I'd gently and ever so quietly lay my bike down and creep up the stairs and on the porch. I'd open the screen door and slip the paper in the door still so that the screen door would close on the paper and not make a sound. When I got home, one time something worse happened. It was dark and rainy morning. It was even thundering and lightning. There was no way I was going to put that paper in Mr. Duke's door. When I got home, Mr. Duke was there and angry too. He didn't like not getting his Herald one little bit. So some things haven't changed. Some things have changed enormously. Now people call and complain when there's a page missing from the e-edition of the paper. So it's all in the evolution.
Yeah. And by the way, I would say excellent service from the Herald Sun on the business side this week, because I didn't get my subscription, but I didn't get my paper, but I did get a voice message saying why, which I appreciated, and then it did come the next day, so thank you.
Just though we weren't playing favorites, I didn't get my paper Wednesday or Thursday either. So.
That makes me feel better. So, and then we'll talk some more about the digital world in a little bit, but how about some of the high points in the history of the Herald itself, the Herald Sun?
Sure.
And, what are some of the moments that, so there was, of course, the founding of the paper in 1889, the Sun. The Herald itself was founded not long afterwards. What were some of the sort of important historical moments?
Sure. The Herald came along in '95. A very significant moment. I mean, one not to be underestimated at all. Came in 1896, a year after the Herald was founded. In 1896, the four people who had founded it were losing interest and losing money. It was a struggle. That's why many of these papers were short-lived. They came and they went very quickly. And eventually, one of the original founders had acquired a half interest up from a quarter interest, and he sold it to a guy named Edward Tyler Rollins for $125.
Wow.
So the elder E.T. Acquired a half interest in the paper, along with a guy named Carl Council, who was the other half owner, I think, at that point, for $125. And that started what, of course, was well over a century of ownership and stewardship of the paper by the Rollins family. In 1910, I mentioned Julian Shakespeare Carr bought the Sun. Between 1910 and 1929, you may see turnover today at papers. The paper had 13 owners, and the Sun had 13 owners and 11 editors. Remember, this was the original paper. It's struggling to keep going. Making money is difficult. So in 1929, probably not aware that the Great Depression was going to start in a matter of months, E.T. bought the Sun, and he paid cash. Frances, his widow, told me a few months ago that one of the proudest things of her late father-in-law was he had acquired that paper, having paid no cash for it, and no debt as the Depression came. And that probably
he paid cash, but no debt.
Right. Okay. It incurred no debt, and therefore was able to withstand the recession with the papers and come through basically unscathed. So, in 1929, he merged the two papers, but they continued to publish separately. I think 1990 is a milestone event. December 31st, 1990 was the last issue of the Durham Sun. Any of you who've lived in other places know that 80s and 90s were not, 70s and 80s and 90s were not kind to African newspapers. We closed the Charlotte News while I was at the Charlotte Observer and Charlotte News about the same time. The Raleigh Times, where I started my career before it was a bar, was closed in the same period. So I would say broadly, the demise of the afternoon newspaper is significant here and elsewhere, done in by evening news. Trucks left the planet at noon with the paper to get them delivered by 5 o'clock, an hour before the evening news told you what actually happened in the stories that they were only being speculated about. In 1991, early 1990s, it was 91, the paper moved out to downtown to its site on Pickett Road. I haven't really gone back and sketched out that decision, or really delved into that decision, but clearly it was part of a wave. Lots of other people were leaving downtown then. Lots of people may wish they had stayed, and lots of people were coming back. In 2005, certainly personally, as well as I think in terms of the community, it was no small event when Paxton Media Group bought the paper from the Rollins family, and again, ending 105 years of association, 111 years of association with the paper for the Rollins family. I've spent some time with Frances, a wonderful person that many of you know. Got to know E.T. just a little bit before he died, which was not long after I came here. And it's humbling, really, to think about the fact that over the entire history of the paper until 2005, the Rollins family had a key role in that paper in the community, and it's tremendous. Frankly, it's quite something of a burden to have that legacy. So, it's changed. Back to your question about change too. Newspapers used to be the fiefdoms of their owner. The Daniels family in Raleigh, the Rollins family here, the Hager family in Owensboro, Kentucky, where Judge Hager bought the paper in 1901 because he lost a judicial race. And people, for better or for worse, sort of plunged on with their style. The Daniels family was deeply engaged in politics. The Rollins family not. Frankly, hardly at all. But those days are gone. And now, like many other institutions, newspapers are essentially corporate entities.
And what does that mean for the coverage? So I think about the N&O and the Charlotte Observer are owned by McClatchy. The Herald Sun is owned by Paxton. The Greensboro and Winston-Salem papers are also owned by chains. And many of the small town papers, if they haven't disappeared, are also owned by chains. And how do you see that making a difference in the way, does it make a difference in coverage, or are there other ways it makes a difference?
It can make a difference, and it cannot make a difference. I mean, part of the difference is simply that, quite honestly, on the upside, corporate ownership, and this was certainly true for the News and Observer with McClatchy. It was certainly true when I spent time in Kentucky. with the Louisville Courier-Journal, a renowned family-owned newspaper that became owned by Gannett in the 80s. You know, the Bingham family, to take an example in Louisville, had not invested in capital improvements in the company in decades. Gannett came in and made substantial capital improvements. So the ability to sort of have deeper pockets for capital improvements is certainly there. There are some economies of scale. There are clearly some, you know, there are some differences. There are decisions that are being made in, I can't remember what the McClatchy headquarters is, but being
California,
made, California, I think, are being made in corporate offices that may have an impact. But I think the company that I happen to come here with really maintains something that was very important in the whole legacy that I mentioned of a century of more of the Rollins family, and that is local coverage decisions, local editorial decisions are best made locally. And they have never, in the entire time I've worked now, it's been 17 years or more for Paxton, have never suggested a coverage bent, a coverage emphasis, never frankly suggested an editorial bent. And if I can tell a quick story that doesn't involve the Herald Sun, but I think tells something about them. When I was in Kentucky, we had a rather abrupt publisher change. And in the interim, while I find a new publisher, the president of the news division was acting publisher. It was a hard-fought gubernatorial race in Kentucky. I was pretty sure that we were going to endorse the Democrat, while every other Paxton paper in the state and the Paxtons themselves heavily favored the Republican candidate. I said, what do you want me to do? I said, if you want to make a group endorsement, I don't like that idea, but I understand many papers do it. Came back to me about 10 minutes later and said, you know this town, you know what you need to do, make your endorsement. We were the only Paxton paper in the state that endorsed the Democratic candidate. So I think, whereas for many, many years, Scripps, which owned a paper across the river in Indiana, which was one of the lessons, comparisons I was drawing, for many years, Scripps, every Scripps paper made the same endorsement in national races. For many years, I think Gannett has tried to shape some of the local coverage decisions of its papers. So I've worked for family-owned newspapers. I've worked for corporate-owned newspapers. I've seen pluses and I've seen challenges both ways.
Right. And then, and then thinking about this heritage and this responsibility a little bit, you and I have talked about the paper's coverage of the Civil Rights Revolution over the years and the coverage of race. I want to read again a little from Gene Anderson. This is from quite a while ago, but this is from the 1900 gubernatorial race in North Carolina, where you all probably know that Charles Aycock was campaigning for governor, and he was running on an education campaign, but also on a segregation campaign. And it talks about how some people, Aycock and the Democrats were talking about what they called Negro domination and how bad this would be. Some people had opposed that, but it said the editor of the Sun, however, was not among them. That paper blatantly sided with the Democrats and indulged in ugly journalism during the campaign. Sticking by one's race was made to seem the ultimate loyalty. Justice did not enter into the question. The newspaper reported at length the campaign of the Democrats, who held a parade flourishing a white supremacy banner and followed by a band in a white float with 16 young ladies, all attired in white, carrying small white flags. Sounds like an interesting parade. Streamers on each side of the float proclaimed, "Protect us with your vote." Despite the enormous Democratic victory, a few fusion candidates won magistrate races in the county. Let me just skip this party. With victory in hand, the Sun adopted a very different tone. In place of hostility and insults, it spoke with arrogance and paternalistic condescension. The unlettered and unlearned colored man will then, this was 1902, cease to be a voter and a disturbing element in the political life of this state, basically calling for the disenfranchisement of African Americans. It went on to say, the white people bear no ill will towards the Negro. They do not propose to harm him or hurt him in any way, but on the other hand, protect him and save him from his white allies who have traded on his vote and secured offices for him to rule over white people. This was not the virulence that you read in the News and Observer at the time, but still, it's really interesting to read that racial history now and sad to read it. And of course, times have changed, thank God. But when you think about the legacy of the paper, how do you reflect on that?
Well, clearly, Steve, I think your reference to the News and Observer is important there. You could read almost any newspaper in the southeastern United States around the turn of the century, the early part of the century, and not find coverage that was remarkably different from that. It was not a proud moment for newspapers in the Southeast. It was not a proud moment for most institutions in the Southeast.
Yeah.
You're right, it was not quite as virulent as the News and Observer, where Josephus Daniels led the revolt that by armed insurrection unseated an African-American government, democratically elected in Wilmington. So I think it was a paper of its times. There are a handful of papers. I can't go back into the early part of the 20th century and say with certainty. There were a handful of newspapers, as many of you know, that were a mere handful, that certainly in the 40s and 50s, when the Civil Rights Revolution was taking hold, were somewhat different. The Anniston Star in Alabama, the Charlotte Observer with Pete McKnight in Charlotte, that sort of tacked against that zeitgeist, if you will. The Herald and Sun were not among them.
And I think even the News and Observer, when I think about, as you mentioned when we talked, when Claude Sitton came to the News and Observer, this really changed their, the way they were, I would say, covering race as well as editorializing. And the Herald really remained, I would say, quite conservative on that issue for a long time. And in fact, the Herald, for most of my years in Durham, I have thought of as extremely conservative politically, frankly, until you arrived. And you have changed the editorial policy of the Herald, and I would say have changed it from the editorials you write, if you don't mind a kind of blunt characterization, from what I would say is blunt in the sense of not fine-grained, not blunt in the sense of hard-hitting. Yeah. But what I would say is that you've changed it from what I would have thought of as a kind of conservative editorial policy with a really sort of strong libertarian streak to what I would call a liberal editorial policy. And I wondered if you have, how has that been? How has that accomplished? Is it something that, I think it's been, frankly, very constructive for our city. But I wondered how you accomplished it. Was it hard to accomplish it? Have you faced backlash? Have there been, so talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I wish I could tell you that there was, I'll show you the blueprints, right? The grand scheme for the change and the transformation of the politics of the Herald Sun. I walked in the door in the early afternoon of January 3rd, 2005, and without giving a great deal of thought, simply proceeded to run the editorial page somewhat as I had run it in Owensboro and in State College, which was somewhat of a reflection of myself. And that's what happened. There was no discussion, there was no, before I came on board, certainly the people who asked me to come here as editor knew what I was doing in Owensboro, so it was no great surprise to them. I'll tell a slightly self-serving anecdote, if I could, that I shared with you when we were talking. I won't mention his name, but a longtime activist in Durham, Duke graduate, longtime participant in many, many political and social activities here, ran into me not that long after I retired in my abortive attempt to retire, and said he was sorry I had left, and said, when you first came here and there was, some of you will recall, a little bit of pushback about our arrival. He said, I happened to be Googling around and I noticed, I guess he wasn't Googling, we didn't have Google then, whatever we did before we Googled, I was looking and I discovered that you're a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, which I was. And he said, I called John Shelp and I said, John, hold on, this may be okay. I think they've hired a liberal. That was, having said that, it was not even a factor of discussion in it. So, I mean, the question of how did the change happen, I don't know. I mean, Bill Hawkins left in the morning, I came in the afternoon, and we had a different approach. My colleagues on the editorial page, I don't want to extend beyond my knowledge that I can personally have, I think, or appeared to be relatively comfortable with what the direction I was somewhat channeling us in. I have no idea, how, I've never actually had that conversation with Ron Langfried or Greg Childers, who were the two other editorial page folks when I got here, about, I guess I did with Ron a couple of times since he became editorial page editor. And I think Ron was, who sadly didn't, died not too long after I came here. I think Ron seemed comfortable with the direction we were going in. The publisher, who was, at that time, had grown up in Durham and was a somewhat more conservative person than I am, never really said anything other than to occasionally, kind of grin wryly at what we were doing. And he'd been my publisher in Owensboro, so there was no reason for him to be surprised by what we did. I wish I could tell you there was a grand sort of blueprint. This is how we're going to take it forward.
Yeah.
I've actually never gone back, other than casually, and really read the editorials of preceding 15 or 20 years. I know by, by description and by anecdote and by the occasional ones I've read that it was different. I do remember the editorials of the newspaper and the news coverage in the late 60s when I was here as a somewhat radical student at Duke. And I will tell you that I would share your characterization that it seemed very conservative at the time. I suspect not as conservative as I remember it, actually.
And so what is your day like now? You wrote an editorial for today.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote a column for today.
Right.
I assume you edited a lot of copy for today, or maybe you have other folks that are editing most of the copy, or how's it working?
Good question, and I've got to try to tell the truth because Nancy will vouch for it if I'm wrong. It's a pretty loose arrangement. I'm not particularly good at structure. I'm not particularly hung up on organization. There may be more similarity to that 1912 photo in our lobby of the 13 people, or whatever was on the staff, in that there's a lot of doing different jobs. So while I'm responsible overall for the content of the paper, overall for the policy of the paper, overall for a lot of the public activity of the paper, and I have two wonderful colleagues who do much of the day-to-day editing, Nancy and Wes Platt, the news editor I mentioned. And Nancy really is in charge of sort of the day-to-day agenda for news coverage. We literally sit about 5 feet apart. I have an office that I use maybe an hour on a day when I spend a lot of time in there. I'd rather be in the newsroom. I'd rather be out where the activity is and where things are happening. And I end up, I do oversee the editorial page these days, personally. It's my job is to be the editorial page editor as well as what I do. And I spend time where I can help out editing local copy, or getting in the way. I'm not sure which. It may be some of both.
And how about the digital, I'm sorry, to get this on. How about the digital edition of the paper, and what are your responsibilities there, and talk about the digital edition a little bit.
The digital edition is probably where the future lies. I mean, not a very profound statement, right? Unfortunately, as you know, and many of you know, the bulk of the revenue that papers get still derives from the print edition. So we're in that transition phase right now. How do we get the money where the audience is going, so that we can continue to do the kind of newspaper work that we've done over the years in the digital edition? Our digital edition is fairly robust. About 8 months ago now, we really made an effort to try to be more responsive during the day. Almost every bit of local news that's in the paper is in the digital edition. We have two versions of it, actually. It's the regular web edition that you're familiar with when you log on to heraldsun.com, and there's some stories there, and you can click on and they open up. And then we have an e-edition that gets some usage, which is basically a PDF replica of the paper. So you can go in there and see the paper, every page of the paper exactly as it is. I think that's, it's not very, this is not an insight. That's where the audience is going. We're struggling, as most papers are, to figure out exactly how, again, to take resources into that without depriving resources from the print product where people are still paying. And we have an older demographic in our readership that still really likes the print paper. And when we say, oh, well, you know, there's more than there is in the paper there on the web, they kind of shrug and say, so what? You know, I have a computer. So we're trying to make that transition too. It'll be an interesting challenge. At some point in the not too distant future, we will follow the path of the News and Observer and a number of other papers, and expecting people who read our online edition to actually pay for our online edition. That's a change that, for a variety of reasons, we've been a little bit slower to make than some other folks, but it's on the horizon, and it's inevitable at pretty much every paper in America.
And do you think that the audience that's reading your online edition is the same group of people that's reading the Herald Sun in print?
There is some overlap. We know there are people who read us both ways, and I'll overgeneralize here. I actually don't have a great deal of demographic detail, but I have no reason to believe that we're not much the same as any other area, where our online audience skews younger and our print audience skews older. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but again, that's part of the transition difficulty. You know, we have a number of young reporters on our staff who I'm pretty sure don't look at the print edition of the newspaper. It's not that they read the newspaper, they read it pretty thoroughly. If we forget to post one of their stories on the web, it's a manual process to get it there. You know, they'll let me know by 8:30 in the morning. If for some reason we get it on the web and then decide to hold it in print, which happens sometimes because of the cycle of the way we're doing these things, days may go by before they realize it's not in the print newspaper. So I think that the change is just happening, and 20 years from now, folks like you and me, who still read the print edition, there'll be fewer of us and we'll be reading less.
Will there be a print edition in 20 years?
In 20 years, I think there will always be some kind of print content. Will it be a daily newspaper as we've come to know it over the last, well, 125 years since you know, four guys decided to get a railroad in a newspaper? Probably not. You've already seen it in a number of cities, a number of fairly sizable cities, where daily publication of a print newspaper has ceased. New Orleans, of course, one of the most famous examples. Huntsville, Alabama, where a colleague of mine used to be editor, although retired before this came along. Detroit, Michigan, where the print edition is sharply curtailed, except 3 days a week. So you're beginning to see that migration happen. Will it be, you know, 10 years before it's complete? 20 years? Hard to say. You know, everybody said that television was going to kill radio. And what radio did was evolve and become a different something than it was. Radio and television probably did kill afternoon newspapers in any competitive market. But I don't know that the digital revolution is going to wipe out completely the print edition, any more than the Kindle is going to wipe out the books we all buy, we hope we all buy, at the Regulator, one of the great independent bookstores in America.
And so, when is the online edition, or will the online edition become more and more its own creature, something separate from the print edition, assuming that they both survive? You know, how do you see that? I struggled with this a lot, of course, being in the news business for a long time, and really have not seen anyone really figure it out. So what are your thoughts on that?
You know, Steve, if I followed it closely enough, and I probably didn't, but what I saw happening, for example, with a weekly, like The Independent, is that it actually was a whole new world. All of a sudden, there was a dailiness to what you did, an hourliness to what you did. And I suspect there were upsides and downsides to that. You didn't have to wait a week to get this great fact you found out into the public domain. On the other hand, you didn't have a week to reflect on what you were doing. It's that yin and yang. For us, you know, a lot of this is back to the future. This is, you may or may not recognize this. This is a telegraph key. This is the telegraph receiving unit. So the telegraph editor, which is what the national editors of newspapers used to be called, would sit there and listen to the dots and dashes that the AP was sending. And then it began to speed up. And it began to sort of become a fire hose of information coming in over the telephone line. And when the UPI and the Associated Press were competitive wire services, when paper published multiple editions, people were racing to be next with the story. AP beat UPI by 35 seconds, and it was a huge break on the story. Those were the days when competing reporters used to pull tricks like go by the nearest payphone to wherever the press conference was happening and unscrew the mouthpiece and stick it in their pocket so their competitors couldn't use the phone when they got back, or they'd hang an out-of-order sign on it. Because minutes mattered, and then we became much more laid back, right? That stopped being the case, and television sort of took over immediacy, and we stopped publishing multiple editions. There'd be 7 or 8 or 9 editions of a Metro newspaper churning out all afternoon and into the night to get the latest facts in. Well, we've gone back to that now, online. All of a sudden, time matters. Speed matters. We're not obsessed about this, but every now and then we'll send a note to each other saying, ha, we got the breaking news about 35 seconds before the WRL had it up. Or, ha, 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 5 minutes after ours, the NNOs went up. We don't say 5 minutes ago the NNO had it. We didn't yet. We don't celebrate their successes. We celebrate ours. So that's making the business, it's dicey. You sort of had time to think about it all day. A reporter would come back from the city council meeting, the Charlotte Observer, at 11 o'clock in the morning, and about 6 o'clock, the story would sort of kind of stroll over to the Metro desk, and for an editor to look at for a couple of hours. Now we're putting that stuff up. People are sending bulletins from their phone in the council chambers while it's happening. Mm-hmm. So it's back to the future, and it's going to be different. So I think the print product is going to continue to be, and maybe not daily, the somewhat more thoughtful, the somewhat more polished version. One good thing about it is if you make a mistake on the web, you can fix it 30 seconds later. If you make a mistake in the print edition, Lynn archives it, and it's there for the next 100 years for everybody to see. So we make more mistakes going faster, but we can fix them faster. Mm-hmm. And it's a whole different sort of venue. And again, I like to think a little bit more back to the days of the 50s, 60s, 70s, kind of the hype, if there were a highlight of the wire service competitiveness, television competitiveness.
But on the other hand, I wonder if, I know this was happened for us, and I wonder if it's true for you, because so much energy was always, once the digital world arrived, so much energy had to be devoted to this kind of trying to be first that it took a lot of resources. And so it hurt our ability to do the longer, more thoughtful pieces because we just didn't have the humans. And I wonder if you think that that's a cost that you all are also facing.
Yeah, it's a daily struggle to figure out how much energy to put into, and we've struggled with this in the last 2 or 3 years. Saying, okay, how much energy are we going to put into the edition that people don't pay us for as opposed to the edition people do pay us for? And this is the edition people don't pay us for, but is where everybody's going versus the one they do pay us for where everybody's leaving. I mean, it's been a real struggle, and I don't begin to have an answer to it. I think we, to some extent, do it by the seat of our pants every day, and probably will for a while to come. Again, it's a very transitional phase of trying to figure out how we're going to make the move from 125 years of print to 125 years of something else, maybe involving print. I'm pretty sure that when James Algernon Robinson and those folks began the Sun in 1889, they had no clue that 125 years later we'd be talking about whether or not what they did had a future.
Well, how do you think then, just to push it a little bit farther on that, in that way, how do you think journalism will be paid for in the future? If, we've seen the disappearance of classified ads,
right.
Almost disappearance.
Right. Pretty close.
Pretty close. The erosion in display advertising. I noticed last year in the General Assembly there was the issue of being threatened with a loss of the legal ads. There's erosion in the subscription base. How, we need journalism. We need more than lots of blogs. We need thoughtful, edited news reporting. And do you have a sense of, going forward, how will that be paid for? Or, what are your ideas about how that will be paid for? I know everybody's struggling.
Well, I mean, trying to I hate this phrase, but as I've grown older and been in the business longer, through more Schewels, I've learned to use words I once dreaded. Trying to monetize what we do on the web is the key. Will it be more user paid for? Probably. Will advertisers begin to recognize, and can we substantiate with data, that there really is an audience for our print product that's valuable? Unfortunately, companies like Google have become so incredibly skillful at making their product, which is our eyeballs, very targeted advertisers. I don't know that newspapers, magazines, television will be able to catch up in some ways with that. Will it become something more of the NPR nonprofit model? As you know, there are a number of experiments going on around the country with trying to develop nonprofit bases for particularly investigative journalism, for developing a nonprofit model for supporting publications. It's wide open right now. If I knew the answer, I would retire again and I'd become a consultant and I'd become very wealthy. But it's...
That still might happen.
It's one of the reasons I think it's fascinating to be in this business. You know, it was fascinating to be in this business when I started in the 1960s, which I keep reminding myself is a long time ago. And it's fascinating now for somewhat different reasons. But, you know, in 1970, 71, when I was at the Raleigh Times, you know, oh, woe is us. How are we going to deal with this? You know, the evening news is making it impossible to be an afternoon newspaper. You know, will there be any future for this? The 1980s, reports saying we need a different kind of journalism. We're doing too much serious stuff, too many city council stories. We need more stories about, you know, about how to cook Brussels sprouts. We need to have more stories that relate to our readers. And I went to the 90s and we talked about becoming involved with the community, you know, sort of like getting a railroad built to Washington Duke's plant. It seems to me that if there's a constant in the 125-year history of the paper, and probably the next 100 or 125 years of news media, it is we don't know what the hell is going to happen next. And trying to sort that out was a challenge for E.T. Rollins in 1929 when he made the decision that it was better to buy his competitor than to compete with it. A pretty visionary thing in 1929 that could have gone hopelessly wrong, and it went hopelessly right. 9 of those 10 newspapers that we mentioned that were started in the 1880s and didn't make it into the 20th century bet wrong. The Sun bet right, at least for the last 125 years. So I'm pretty confident we're going to bet right again if we can ever figure out what the bet is for the next few years.
Well, I think it would be fun to have a show of hands of those people who I'm assuming that everybody here, because you're interested in the Herald Sun, you would come to this, you read the Herald Sun in print. How many people read the Herald Sun online? A few, and so it'll be really interesting to see how that future arrives. It's really tricky.
If we walked up the street to Bull City Forward and asked that question,
Yeah.
I bet it would be inverted.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I was in a room of younger people once, and we were asked, who in this room gets their print edition, cup of coffee, sits down in the morning and reads their paper, and 2 of us.
Right. And so yeah, go ahead. I guess go ahead, Bob, and I have another question
Sure.
about related to
Yeah, just real quickly on that point. I mean, up until a couple of years ago, people in the college newspaper world told me over and over again that colleges, ironically, were still havens of print readership. That college students tended to pick up the Chronicle, the Tar Heel, the Technician at NC State because the price point was unbeatable, right? It was free. It was widely distributed. You pick it up on the way to class, and you read it, and you throw it down, and you go on to your next class. That's unraveling. The Duke Chronicle this fall stopped publishing on Fridays. The first time it has not been a 5-day-a-week newspaper since I made it one in 1967. So it's an inevitable wave, I think, coming forward as the next demographic bulge comes through and changes it.
Well, you raise an interesting point, and what I wonder is, And I guess this is the question for me is, can news, so we know that, so let me ask another question. Raise your hand if you get other news sources from the internet. Okay, so many more people. And so I think the question for newspapers, I know this was what I always felt that the Independent and could never figure out how to successfully make happen, is how do we help people distinguish in their minds a newspaper from a blog, you know, a newspaper online from a blog? How do we get people to still want to read their local news? Let me ask you one more question. How many of you get local news online? Local online, so fewer, but still some. Okay, and so, but our newspapers have a very, very particular function, right? We edit, we have standards of fairness, and we have standards of fact checking, and we have all these kinds of standards that many blogs who people might be getting their local news from don't have. These standards are expensive because it means you have to have people that can edit, you have to have people that can fact check, and you have to have people that can proofread. And it's an incredibly valuable function, but how do we get people to think of the Herald Sun online as more than a blog and want to get their news from it? Do you have any sense of that?
Well,
Let me just say that I don't have any idea how to do it, but I wonder what you think.
you know, this is going to seem overly simplistic, Steve, but I mean, I think the answer ultimately, you know, without sort of getting too racked up in the hour-to-hour panic that we all go through with this, is being true to our heritage and being true to ourselves. I mean, I was looking for it and I couldn't find it, but there was around the time the Herald and the Sun were merging, there was a column, I think, in one or the other, the editors writing about how local news had been what they tried to, you know, covering Durham better than anybody else. So I think being true to that legacy of covering Durham better than anyone else is part of it. I think over time, and you know, maybe I'm whistling through the graveyard, but I think this is beginning to happen, that people are beginning to sense that there is a difference between Joe's blog and the verified, vetted, and sort of authenticated information on a news website, whether it's us, the News and Observer, WRAL, I mean, whatever. I think that's beginning to happen. I don't think we're going to be able to let it happen by magic. I think we're going to have to do it by doing it over and over and over again. But I would love to tell an anecdote. It's been 3 or 4 years ago now that somehow it became racing around the blogosphere in sort of the viral way that it can. That Target was giving away eyeglasses for 12-year-old kids or something like that. I don't know the exact specifics about that. And people began racing back and forth. It was bouncing over the internet. And so, you know, it's like I turned to a reporter and they called Target, and Target said, nope, no truth to it, we'll put that up online. I mean, I think that's, you know, the role that we perform there, which is saying, oh, is this true? And then put it in the paper, is going to carry great weight over time. If we can, I mean, the $64 question is, you know, can we kind of weather this storm? And it is a storm, and it's a little bit like trying to get home on Wednesday if you waited for 1:30 to leave your office.
Right.
You know, we've been stuck in this traffic for 2.5 hours now. We're still coaching our vehicles. But if we can get through that, I think the sun is going to come up, if you will, and there's going to be a future for what news organizations do. Will there be fewer of us? Yes, there are fewer of us than there were. And 10 newspapers in Durham when it was a much smaller place. You know, one of the great things back then was almost anybody could kind of start a newspaper. There wasn't a huge capital cost. You get someone to print you and you can start. Well, that's what we're seeing with the web. I mean, anybody can start publishing a blog or a news source. And eventually, bless evolutionary theory, the strong survived and the weak died out. And I think that's going to be what the immediate future holds for news.
I mean, when I started in the newspaper business, we could do it because the barrier to entry was really low. We didn't have to buy a press.
Right.
You guys have a press, you got to pay for it. We didn't need anything but a couple of computers and a little office. But somebody who's starting a blog, as you say, their barrier to entry is much, much lower.
Zero, I mean, it's an internet service provider, I suppose, and how to use WordPress.
Right. So but let's come back now to this idea of covering Durham better than anybody else in the sense of who I think of as Durham is lucky to be a 2-newspaper town. We have, not only do we have the Herald, but we also have the News and Observer, and I'm a news junkie, so I get them both. And I read very different newspapers every day. That's what's interesting to me. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. We've already talked about the editorials, but let's see if I can get the front pages. Yeah, here's the Herald's front page today. Vote due Monday on solicitation rules is above the fold. City council story. Jaden Sharp lives on. This is a story about a young man in Durham, a 9-year-old, who was murdered, and then a foundation is being started by his family. There's some photographs and a story about Becky Heron and her funeral. And then Dawn has a story, a column rather, about this. The headline is "Snowfall Shows We Haven't Forgotten Our Manners," so you all know what that's about. So that's, and then you've got a little small photograph of looks like Rashid Suleiman making a shot for Duke. Okay, so that's the that's the Herald Sun's front page. The NNO's front page. It's got a snow story. It's bylined Raleigh. It's got a state worker fights for his job. It's bylined Raleigh, and then it's got a Red Wolf Ranch dispute bylined Cresswell. A very different front page, both in look and in content. So I'm wondering, how did you decide what was on the front page today? Who decided? How did you decide? And how do you think about that each day?
Sure. Many of you have heard me say this before. It's far more art than science. There's not some algorithm that we can apply and say, okay, this story gets 17.6 points and this one gets 17.3 points. So we're going to put the 17.6 points out there and 17.3 goes inside. It's more visceral than that in many ways. I think to frame the discussion as you just posted on the 2 front pages, the News and Observer is a statewide newspaper with statewide ambitions and statewide, if you will, periscope reaching out. And you see that reflected in there. And the News and Observer, one of the great ironies of my life is in 1970, I started my professional adult newspaper competing against the News and Observer. And here I am, 46 years later, competing against the News and Observer. And again, ironically, the way the Raleigh Times set out to differentiate itself from its jointly owned, but nonetheless very competitive neighbor upstairs, the News and Observer, well, in those days, and partly it was by not being dull, which the News and Observer, under my good friend Claude, tended to be sometimes, but by focusing on local news. We would differentiate ourselves. They could cover every subcommittee meeting on Jones Street they wanted to, and we were going to cover the Public Works Committee meeting at the Raleigh City Council. And I think you see that really reflected in today's coverage. To us, it's very important that the City Council, even if my colleague here weren't on it, very important to us that the City Council is finally going to resolve perhaps the long-running, very Durham-like debate over how to deal with panhandlers, solicitors, roadside solicitors. Becky Heron's memorial service for a person who was an icon and a treasure in this community was a layup. We didn't have a lot of discussion about whether that was the centerpiece story, but we just knew it. I mean, and again, I've talked again about the fact that, and I don't want to embarrass Nancy because she's here. I mean, Nancy and I have worked together now, with both of us having some time off for good behavior, for 9+ years. We've got a pretty good sense of each other's thought process, but not so good that we can't say, what the hell do you mean by that, once in a while, to keep us from going off the rails. So a lot of it's almost organic. The Becky Heron Memorial Service is there. It's going to be our centerpiece on Sunday. The only question that might have changed that was we weren't sure we were going to be able to get in to take photographs. There was a lot of sort of back and forth to try to see if we could do that. We didn't want to be invasive. We didn't want to intrude upon that service. I just thought that I think all of us thought the story about Jadan, the foundation, was a wonderful sort of Durham story, trying to make something positive out of the in this particular case, apparently mindless, completely accidental death of a 9-year-old. I mean, the rap is that we published, newspapers only published bad news, right? We publish our share of bad news, but we also have a particular desire for and penchant for the story that says people are doing good things, and I think Big Shot Island Institute is that. And then Don's column, which I think is a wonderful addition to the paper, is simply a fixture out there every Sunday. It's not something we think about.
Right.
When we made the decision to concentrate local news in the front section of the newspaper, which was shortly after I came back, and was part of the evolution of this paper to be a more and more local newspaper with each passing year since I've been here. It also said we were going to take our local columnists, and we have 3 of them we're very proud of right now, Don West Black and Neil Offen, who's still writing even though he's retired from the paper, and put that up front because they're local people, known personalities writing about local things. The News Observer serves a different audience in a different way with a different view. And I think the front pages today, in fact, were very emblematic of the two. And as for the sports teasers, I mean, when I left here in 1970, when I came back in 2005, 2 things remained true. You couldn't go wrong by putting Duke and UNC basketball on the page of the newspaper. So, as long as you put them both out there. God help us.
Right.
Put one over the other. Right.
I'm going to ask Bob one more question, and then we'll throw it up for questions and answers. And my question is, what would you say to a young person today? I have students at Duke who want to go into journalism.
Right.
I don't know that they know that they want to go into newspapers, but I'm wondering, what would you say to a young person today? Would you recommend that they take that they go into a newspaper career?
Absolutely. Not necessarily a newspaper career. I've been guilty of actually doing this very thing with people. It's kind of an off-track story, but Nancy and I both have had some involvement with the technician at NC State over the years. And we both were very fond of a young man who became editor about 2 years ago and was going to dental school. And we spent the better part of his year as editor trying to convince him he should go into journalism rather than dentistry. We failed. But that's how, I mean, I had no, I don't speak for Nancy, but I think it's true, no inhibition at all about telling a young man that there was a great future in journalism. Now, is there a great future in learning to be a press operator? Any more than there was a great future 50 years ago in learning to be a line type operator? No. And if you want a career in journalism, you better do more than just learn the AP style book and learn how to write an inverted pyramid lead and how to change the ribbons on a typewriter, which I guess you don't need to know anymore. You better learn to shoot video with your phone, and you better learn to post it from a coffee shop, and you better learn to do 3 things at once, and you better learn to, at the same time that you're tweeting play-by-play the game from the arena, that you're thinking through the story that you can do uniquely because you're there and because you've had 20 years of experience in writing about sports, to bring an insight or a picture of that game to readers in print or online that the guy who's only, the woman who's only tweeting from the stands is doing. We need to be able to do both, and I think that's a great challenge to a young person going into journalism. We still make a difference. I'd like to think in a small way, for better or for worse, and people can choose up sides on these things. I think for better or for worse, we played a role in the unraveling of the last superintendent for the Durham Public Schools by relentlessly reporting continued troubles that were there. I think we play a role in letting our readers, the citizens of Durham, know what you guys are doing on the city council so that they can judge you with balance when the time comes to do. I thought that was a lot of fun in 1965 when I started working for the Miami Times. I think it's a lot of fun now. I think it means something, and I have no problem at all telling people that. I think James Algernon Robinson and Mr. Council and E.T. Rollins thought that when they bought a newspaper in 1896 and thought, we can do something with this. I think that's still true, and I would have no qualms whatsoever about telling a 21-year-old that this is something that makes a difference and you ought to do it.
Great. Okay, and so now we'll have some questions. Yeah. So now we'll have some questions. Do we have time for some questions, Lynn?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to raise your hands, and I'm going to sort of bow out of this part, and Bob, you can ask Bob, and we'll take it from there.
Bob, I'm interested in knowing about stories local stories that were picked up nationally,
Uh-huh.
and how recognizing now that if we have a good story locally, it can actually, there's a lot of national interest, and I'm wondering if that affects how you cover certain stories, or or if there's a good example of a story like that, like whether it be the lacrosse scandal or whether it be the Eve Carlson thing, can you talk about a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, Durham happens to be, because of the nature of the area and the market, we're in a place where local stories are often national stories. I mean, it's just the nature of the case. I mean, whether it's lacrosse, whether it's Eve Carson, whether it's whether it's a guy winning a Nobel Prize. I mean, that tends to happen. It doesn't really influence how we approach it. It might influence the competitive pressures, but that's been true forever. I mean, in 1973, 74, when I was in Raleigh at the Times, there was a famous trial of a African-American woman who was charged with murder for killing a jailer down east. Because they couldn't get a fair trial, they thought, in the county down east where it happened. They moved the venue to Raleigh, and so we're surrounded by reporters from every national media in the country, and we're about 26-year-olds trying to put out the Raleigh Times. That was pretty heady, actually, at that moment. But it doesn't really affect, I don't think, what we do. It does affect how people, how widely something might spread. I do think sometimes that we try to be conscious of the fact that the further you are from the scene of a story, and I know this from years and years of watching this, the more muddled the details get and the more frozen perceptions are. So I think sometimes we can play a role in that. And again, the ability of our story to be as readily available to a reader in Seattle, Washington, as a story from the Seattle Times has somewhat changed the nature of that. Because if there's a story here that's made the national wires, people would actually come read our coverage, or the News Observer's coverage of it, for that matter, and get a somewhat more close to the action slant on it. But I think it happens faster than you see.
I'm interested in particular in the news, setting the news agenda, and to what extent do reader comments and tips advance the paper's reporting?
Sure.
And do you have enough staff? I mean, are you frustrated often that you can't follow tips that you get?
Always. When I was an assistant metro editor at the Charlotte Observer in the late 1970s, I think we had 41 people on the metro staff, and there were 6 of us on the metro desk, or assistant metro editors. And on Friday morning, there was never anybody to do the story we needed to get done. And it was just, I don't care. Friday morning, Jimmy's got a weekender, so John's still down at the coast, Milton's wrapping up his council takeout, and then so-and-so is off. You never have enough reporters in this business. Some of you, if you've suggested stories to me over the years, have probably heard more than once, and I hope it doesn't happen too often, I repeat myself, that there are always more good stories on our radar than we or any other newspaper can do. So it becomes, back to your question, Steve, sort of about the front page. Well, how do you decide? Instinct, some sense of what readers want to know about, some sense of its importance. I mean, it's, and frankly, sometimes a sense it's going to be a good read or a good yarn, so let's go after it. But there are a lot of good stories we don't cover. It's been true for me ever since I've been in this business. There are probably a lot of bad stories we do cover because we didn't realize at the outset they weren't going to be very good stories. I mean, sometimes you drill a dry well in this business. But you try to make it, we love reader tips. The other cliche that my colleagues have heard me say way more often than they should have to is we can't cover everything we know about. We cannot cover a single thing we don't know about. And I'm kind of flattered sometimes by the presumption that we know everything. Why didn't you cover that? I saw 6 police cars there off Hillendale Road yesterday. Why wasn't it in my newspaper this morning? What happened? I don't know. It's the first I knew about it. We'll find out. In this particular case, we did, and it turned out to be a story the next day. So it's a bunch of different factors that go into it. Yeah.
What's the idea of the separate Miami or Durham Herald on Sunday versus the Herald Sun?
We decided about a year and a half ago that we wanted to take something we've been doing in the metro section of the newspaper, which was called Your Community Pages, and sort of expand on that idea and make it a section that was really sort of hyper-local and intensely local. The idea was that much of it would be reader-generated content. It still is in that sense, or it always has been in that sense, but I decided early on, because it was shortly after I came back to the paper, that if I was going to be facing 6 pages a week of something that was going to be filled with reader-generated content, if I simply waited for something to come over the transom, do you all remember what a transom is? Come over the transom. I use this sometimes with younger colleagues in the blank book. Wait for something to come over the transom. I'd be staring at empty pages, so I've gone out and partnered with a number of people in the community to sort of contribute pieces for that. But it's an effort to sort of be a weekly local section, with a little bit different bent, a little bit more access for readers to get stuff into. We've got a couple of folks who regularly, Kent Fletcher, bless his heart, who sends in photos with some frequency for that edition. We don't get as much of that as we'd like to, and maybe I've tilted a little bit too much toward the formulaic, but the idea is to be a little bit more, and build on that whole notion of local. It's also sort of a companion to the Chapel Hill Herald that we publish on Sundays just for our Chapel Hill and Orange County readers, and there's some features that go in both. Announcements, pets, and things like that span the 2 lines.
Maybe one more question, anybody else has something?
Thank you.
I want to thank Bob, and I also want to congratulate Bob on the fabulous job he does. This is an incredibly important institution. If you don't subscribe to the Herald, you need to. If you want Durham to have the kind of careful attention paid to our government, to all of our institutions that we need strong daily journalism. The Herald is providing it for us, so support your local newspaper.
Amen. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Definitely forgot.
Then you'd wonder where they were, or somebody would step on.